exponentially. And there is growing evidence that a number of these different stresses that we have previously looked at individually, such as global deoxygenation, global acidification, marine heat waves, actually have a cumulative effect. And there has been growing evidence that we really need to move to look at them in a multi-stressor approach. And to that effect, the session today really aims to highlight some of these issues through a set of panelists that we have here who represent a diverse set of issues and areas of expertise. So today's session, we will start with Denise Breitberg, who is a senior scientist emerita from the Smithsonian. And she will start the session by providing us an overview of the issue in the broad context. Following that, we will then have two young professionals who are very active in the field. They will be appearing to us virtually, the first of which is Carla Edworthy from the South African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity. And she will be talking very specifically about some of the issues as it relates to the problem in coastal ecosystems. Following that, we will have Natalia Gallo from the University of Bergen, and she is going to provide a slightly different perspective from the point of view of deep ocean systems and some of those issues. And then finally, we have here David Abura, who is with Cordio and really been working on really the first and major ecosystems that are experiencing this, coral reefs. And so he is going to end that session by providing us some of his insights on the issue. Following the session, we will have a question and answer session to the panelists, and depending on how that goes and your interest, we would also take questions from you. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Denise to start this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you IUCN for organizing this. I don't have earphones in, so I can't tell how loud I'm speaking. Just wave if I'm starting to shout at you. Why are we here? I mean, the oceans sustain us, they inspire us, and they protect us. They're a source of oxygen that we breathe. They provide protein for food. They've been a pathway for commerce and human migration, and determined the course of civilizations, unfortunately sometimes through wars. And they buffer us from problems created by the 7.9 billion people on Earth. And as a result of the activities of that huge human population, the number and intensity of stressors affecting the ocean is rapidly increasing. In a study looking just over an 11-year period, over 81% of the ocean had detectably increased numbers and strengths of stressor effects, including the climate change stressors of warming, acidification, deoxygenation, and marine heat waves, as well as other global stressors, including human overfishing and plastics, habitat destruction, and others. So first of all, let me just define what I'm talking about, because there are lots of different technical definitions, but really all we're talking about here is a physical, chemical, or biological factor that impairs the functioning of a biological or ecological system. And in this case, what we're focusing on really are human-caused stressors. But why consider ocean changes, including those caused by climate change, in a multiple stressor framework? One of the big reasons is that the combined effects of stressors can be nonlinear. They can be greater than or less than or just qualitatively different from the effects of individual stressors if we just add them together. And really in our everyday experiences, we know that this is true. We know that malnutrition increases susceptibility to disease, that deforestation increases the chance of landslides following an earthquake like what we saw in Haiti, and that climate change increases the geographic range of invasive agricultural pests that threaten food supplies. And in a coastal marine example at the ocean's margins, There was increased damage and loss of human lives in the tsunami of 2004 at locations where coral reefs and mangroves had been previously destroyed. And so what I'd like to do is just run through some of the examples that illustrate why multiple stressors is really the umbrella we should be thinking about, rather than only focusing on individual stressors and arguing among ourselves, whether we're researchers looking for funds or we are conservation organizations looking to enact policies. Why really thinking about the totality is helpful. For one example, as I mentioned, the combination of stressors can have greater effects than simply the sum of individual stressors. Rising temperatures increase oxygen requirements of cold-blooded animals, whether you look at what happens to an individual species or as over here across species, where just a 6-degree increase in temperature greatly increases the oxygen requirements. And at the same time, increasing ocean temperatures reduce oxygen availability. Warmer water holds less oxygen, and it reduces the amount of mixing that goes on that brings that oxygen down to depths. The other thing from a policy or management perspective is that stressors can be linked by a common cause, and there may be some causes that we can address that will really help many things, many problems in the ocean. And with climate change, we've gotten to calling the ocean becoming hot, sour, and breathless, because increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide causes warming, it causes acidification, and it also causes deoxygenation. Climate change stressors also interact with other global change stressors, and especially one of the cases that this is potentially really important is with fisheries. When oxygen becomes low at depth and that expands, many mobile animals will avoid it. And what happens, what they've seen with billfish, with blue sharks, with shrimp, these animals will move up in the water column. The wide-ranging species like billfish and blue sharks become much more accessible to fisheries, potentially increasing the likelihood of overfishing. And in the Gulf of Mexico, you can even see a correlation between the occurrence where the fishing boats are, the shrimp boats, and where the shrimp are aggregating, that becomes stronger the larger the dead zone. Stressors like low oxygen also combined with pathogens, resulting in increased disease and mortality. And this has been seen in a very wide range of animals, from fish to shrimp to oysters to rock lobsters, and a very wide range of pathogens too. Basically, low oxygen can interfere with the immune response of animals, and then when pathogens are present, disease problems are worse and more widespread. The effects of multiple stressors also cascade through food webs and ecosystems. In the West Coast in the United States, there was a problem with sea star wasting disease, followed by a marine heat wave, which then essentially wiped out over large areas the very large bull kelp that are really foundation species of those ecosystems. The result then was urchin barrens, followed by an abalone die-off, which then resulted in a closure to the fishery, which of course then affects the livelihood of the coastal fishing communities. And these effects are not limited in time or space. Through epigenetics, they can be carried on future generations, and they can extend over large areas of space. The fair and effective management and stakeholder support also depend on the correct identification of cause and effect. In Chesapeake Bay, we had a real problem implementing nutrient reduction strategies because the fishermen would blame the farmers, who blamed sewage treatment plant operators, and it wasn't really until we were better able to parse out the effects of these different groups that we could begin real work. And when we throw climate change stressors on top of that, it becomes even more complicated. There is a potential that controlling local stressors can increase the resilience of species and of ecosystems to climate change stressors. And there's been some really nice studies looking at the potential for this in the Mediterranean. But there are real equity issues that we need to address when we think about doing these kind of trade-offs in terms of which stressors to address. When overfishing is identified under ideal circumstances, not necessarily the way it really happens, but under ideal circumstances, you can very rapidly develop regulations and put them into effect and implement them. And if you're lucky, you can get very rapid responses in the course of less than a decade, say, or a couple of decades in improvements, especially with highly fecund mobile species. But climate change, on the other hand, we've seen is, decades to come to agreements, decades for implementation, and then the response will be very, very slow because of lags built into the system. And the problem is the potential for then unfair burdens being placed in sectors that can be addressed more rapidly. And so equity is something that really needs to be kept in mind. This is being recognized. The importance of multiple stressors is being recognized. The UN Decade for Ocean Science is including in one of its major challenges understanding the effects of multiple stressors on ocean ecosystems. And it's an important step. And if we truly want to conserve, restore, and wisely manage our oceans, if we're concerned about natural resources, diversity, and their wonders, we really need to consider the totality of human influence in our approach. So, thank you.
Thank you, Denise, for that very broad introduction to the issues and covering some of those critical areas. What I would like to do is now move on to our next presenter, Carla. I think we've got actually, yep, go ahead, please. Natalia, I think you're next. Would you like to start?
Hi, I think Carla is actually going next, but maybe if she speaks, then the monitor will be switched to her.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay, Carla, we've got you.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Edworthy, and I'm joining you from all the way over the seas in South Africa this evening. And I'm going to give a really short perspective on the issue of multi-stressors associated with global changes and climate change from South Africa's marine environments. So the biggest problem with global climate change is that, as the name suggests, it is a global problem, but it has significant local impacts on resources, industries, economies, and livelihoods. So despite the smaller developing countries not being the largest contributors to global carbon emissions, the greatest impacts are often occurring in these regions where there's still a strong reliance on resources from the environment. I prefer to speak about global change rather than focusing only on climate, because their associated stresses are not mutually exclusive. So in a country like South Africa, for example, not only are ecosystems affected by global climate change, But there are also additional pressures of overfishing, habitat destruction, and pollution, and that's just to mention a few. The biggest concern for the developing countries is the general lack of data to inform mitigation and adaptation to the impacts of global change and climate change. And this is particularly for the valuable marine resources. So there's really an urgent need to understand local scenarios in order to inform our local responses. In South Africa, research assessing the response of marine species with a focus on those that serve as valuable resources to people has been ongoing and increasing significantly recently. And there's examples of several studies that have assessed the impact of either warming, hypoxia, or acidification on marine organisms. So as an example, in our research group alone, we have assessed the impact of all of these stresses on some of our most common coastal fisheries species. And I just briefly wanted to show some examples, and I'm not sure if my slides are visible. If they are, I wanted to give an example of two coastal fishes, which really showed a very different response to acidification treatments. So this really indicated the necessity for studies on multiple species because they all respond really differently. So the species, the one coastal species that we looked at is named blacktail. And this species was really tolerant of strongly acidified experimental treatment levels. And these treatments even exceeded the projected ocean acidification scenarios for the future. Whereas another coastal species with a really similar distribution to the blacktail, I can see the slides at the moment, so I'm speaking about the images at the bottom, they were really sensitive to even moderately acidified treatments. And despite the blacktail's tolerance to acidification, a separate study showed some temperature sensitivity. So this suggested that even though the species may be able to tolerate future acidification, it might not even survive warming. So the interaction between these two stresses is something we still need to assess. But this just highlights the importance of identifying the true sensitivity of the species to future conditions. And despite our understanding of the impacts of these individual stresses on some of our key marine species, we are not yet really equipped to make projections for the future when all the interacting stresses are considered, although it is clear that this is definitely necessary. And this is because the experiments to assess the interacting effects of multiple stresses are really complex to design and implement and analyze, and as such, they require significantly more resources, which is something that we are lacking at the moment. So just to conclude, we still have a long way to go to fully understand the multiple stresses faced by marine organisms in light of global climate change, and we'll probably never fully understand all of the interactions. But I'd like to emphasize as a take-home message the need for local information on the various climate scenarios in order to understand our local species responses. And this is critical information to inform adaptation and mitigation, which especially needs to be considered in the context of those additional stresses like overfishing and pollution, etc. So effort really should be boosted in regions where the data is deficient in order to contribute these areas to our global understanding of the global climate and global change problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Carla, for that introduction to some of the critical issues that we face in coastal systems, and also the issue of data deficiency, which we will touch on later, which is so important to understanding the problem. Our next guest is Natalia, and hopefully we'll have her, and we'll get you back very shortly for some questions. So hang in there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I do have some slides, so hopefully those can be brought up.
We can see you now.
Can you see the slides? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. My name is Natalia Gallo, and I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Bergen. My research focuses on how climate change impacts deep sea ecosystems, meaning those regions that are deeper than 200 meters, which is actually most of the marine environment. And today I'll share how deoxygenation and acidification co-occur as climate stressors in deep sea ecosystems and give examples of how these stressors have affected coastal marine industries. Next slide, please. I'll do this by focusing on two different regions, the California Current and Western Norwegian fjords. Before coming to Bergen, I was previously at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and worked in the California Current region, which is shown by the star on the left. This is an eastern boundary upwelling ecosystem with really productive surface conditions and a midwater severely hypoxic zone known as an oxygen minimum zone. It's a continental margin region where the continental shelf and slope lead to the deep sea as you move offshore. In contrast, I'm now working on Western Norwegian fjord ecosystems at the University of Bergen. These are iconic deep sea ecosystems that are largely surrounded by land and support many economically important commercial activities such as salmon aquaculture production and tourism. Though seemingly different, both of these deep sea ecosystems have been experiencing climate change-driven declines in oxygen and pH. Next slide, please. If you deploy an oxygen sensor through the water column off of California, as you can see in this profile on the left, you will see that oxygen levels are high at the surface, but by about 400 meters, they are so low as to be considered severely hypoxic, meaning that sensitive animals are excluded from these areas. Because oxygen is used up through the process of respiration, which also produces carbon dioxide, these low oxygen regions are also high in carbon dioxide, and therefore more acidic than surface waters. While oxygen minimum zones are a natural phenomena, they are becoming more extreme and expanding in size with climate change. When wind-driven upwelling brings these deep, low oxygen, low pH waters to shallower depths near the coast, as you can see in the orange and red regions in the map in the middle, it can have negative effects, for example, weakening the shells of small calcifiers called pteropods. Coastal industries can also be disrupted through mortality events of Dungeness crabs and rockfish, as well as the mortality of larval shellfish in hatcheries. Impacts are already being felt now, but deoxygenation and acidification will put both deep sea communities and coastal communities on the US West Coast under greater stress in coming years. Next slide, please. The situation in Norwegian fjords is a little different, but this is also a deep sea ecosystem experiencing the combined stressors of deoxygenation and acidification. The basins of fjords are deep, but water enters the fjord through shallow passages called sills, and the oceanographic conditions offshore can affect how frequently fjord basin water is renewed. In the figure on the upper right, you can see new water entering the fjord basin. When the basin water is not renewed for many years, the oxygen is used up and decreases through time, as you can see in the first figure below, which is a time series of measurements of oxygen in a fjord called Mossfjord between 2011 and 2021. Since the consumption of oxygen also produces carbon dioxide through respiration, these basin waters also become more acidic as they lose oxygen. Climate change leads to less frequent deep water renewal events, leading to longer periods of low oxygen and low pH conditions in the fjords. Salmon aquaculture is a very important economic engine in Norway, and pens are placed in many of these fjords. Previously, there were 5 salmon pens in Mossfjord. However, due to the extreme low oxygen conditions in the fjord in 2017, the regional government required that some of the farms be closed and moved. Deoxygenation has been occurring in several fjords, prompting recent media attention on the topic. Though deoxygenation and acidification co-occur as stressors in deep sea ecosystems, different species may show different sensitivities to the two stressors, which requires further study. Next slide, please. Though this intervention was short, I hope you have seen that acidification and deoxygenation are two climate-driven stressors that co-occur in deep sea ecosystems, and that even though these changes may occur in the deep, the impacts affect coastal species and economies as well. However, we would not know that these changes are occurring if not for sustained monitoring in these ecosystems, like the US West Coast Cal Coffee Program or the NOAA West Coast Ocean Acidification Cruises, or measurements by the Institute of Marine Research and the University of Bergen here in the fjords. Sustained monitoring for physical, chemical, and ecological variables in the deep sea is key for tracking, understanding, and managing impacts, and therefore sustainably managing our marine ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia, for that very interesting information about demonstrating the impact in two very diverse systems. I'm now going to invite David to come up and make his intervention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Janaka. And good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I will do is, so my name is David Obura, and I work on coral reefs based in Kenya, in East Africa. And and I'll present, let's see if I can go back. If I can go back one click. So that I'll try and, what I'll do anyway is to take the discussion now a little bit more to how can we try and address some of these issues in different contexts. And the context that I have been working in is the coral reef systems, a bit picking up on Carol's, I think, presentation from South Africa, as we're dealing with a lot of small-scale fisheries, a lot of coastal development, and growing population. And so while we have a lot of challenges with reefs now, we're only going to get more in the future. Coming to the end of this session, I won't spend a lot of time going through some of the... No, I'd like to go back a little bit, please. I don't know who has control. Okay. Yes, so there are multiple stresses affecting reefs. Coral bleaching and climate change, of course, is the one that or coral bleaching from thermal stress, from warming. Ocean acidification is going to increasingly affect corals, and deoxygenation. But then there are all these local threats around fishing, dynamite fishing in some cases, anchoring and direct damage, but then also coastal development and dredging at the bottom, and then siltation from land. Now, to the next slide, in terms of trying to think about how to deal with this, one approach that, with a lack of data and a lack of, a lot of science capacity to really study these issues in general, really picked up on developing a narrative approach and really picking up on the Sustainable Development Goals, which in a sense are very much the flip side to the multi-stressor model in terms of thinking about the multiple relationships between nature, people and economies. I wrote a paper on this, which was very dry a year ago, but now this is coming out actually in this Current Conservation Journal, which is an online illustrated journal from India, where they beautifully illustrate articles. And I think it's a great medium to try and get this message across. And this really tries to get at how people depend on a coral reef and building it up through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I won't go through the whole thing, but if you click once, you can see in this illustration, this is the fishing couple. Hamisi is a husband, Mariam is a fish seller, the wife. They depend on the reef. And if we click once, then the image will open up. And there are numbers around all of these. Oh, sorry, my presentation hasn't worked very well. I think there are delays in there that haven't come through. But if you ignore the things on the bottom and the top for the moment, you can see how the story around this coral reef builds up with the numbered little icons underneath about how the reef is managed through a community management area. There's tourism development and local tourism operators. There's a governance around them. There's climate and energy issues around this reef. And you can essentially write the story of this area using the Sustainable Development Goals, in this case from the perspective of this family. But you could write a similar story from the perspective of any of these operators, but all of them come back to depending on the coral reef over here. And one thing that I find really difficult to understand in a lot of writing about, environmental stresses and growing stresses on ecosystems is that, we write in spite of the dependence on people, or in spite of the interest of all these different groups on a particular area, this area is declining. But it's because of all of these interests and the complexity of the stresses that they impose on this reef system that we're getting decline in the reef system. So in terms of thinking about adaptation measures and turning towards solutions, in some contexts we call them nature-based solutions. This came out of a climate context. In conservation we're talking about nature-based solutions a lot. But in Africa and in communities like this, they're very suspicious of the term nature-based solutions. They don't like it because their experience of it has been in the misuse perhaps of designing nature-based solutions around just carbon sequestration and monocultures of trees or oil palm maize for bioenergy and things like that. And a lot of these things are very damaging both to nature and to people who depend on the nature in those areas. So let's talk about natural solutions, but to really use this as a focus for conservation and sustainability, not just in the best spaces for biodiversity conservation, but in the shared spaces where people live and work and where they're highly dependent on these systems. And so in trying to think about how to resolve some of these multiple stressor issues where you have multiple uses is to then think about sustainability and sustainable development goals in each of these different uses or each of these different components of this narrative or this model. You could design a natural solution or a nature-based solution to resolve or to reduce the threat of that activity on the reef system over here. So locally conserved and managed areas relate to protection over here. The equity of access to and the use of the benefits is essential, that the benefits from this region are shared well and equitably amongst all the different people who are dependent on it. Could have sustainable tourism and businesses as one way to reduce the pressures that come from the tourist industry and development. Waste management, governance aspects are essential. How do you develop governance to manage different stresses so everybody does their part to reduce their impacts on the system and do it in an integrated way. Local community authorities are essential. There are energy solutions, and of course education and awareness sort of all ties it together. So this is the last slide, and the idea here is to really come, we need to understand this system very well. Unfortunately for coral reefs, we do have a very good understanding. I think the science around coral reefs is very good right now. Sadly, a little bit too late, as they're declining so fast. But we can develop solutions with limited information, particularly when you look at a local area and come in and look at the high resolution detail of what's happening in that area, who the stakeholders or shareholders are, and who can make decisions about what they do to resolve their contributions to the problem. So I'll finish with that.
Thank you, David, for that very informative session on understanding actually the importance of integrating this into the SDGs and also taking into account equity and issues. I do have some questions for the panelists, but I would like to start by maybe, is there a question that anybody has in the audience? If not, maybe we'll start with the first question, which really centers around, and I'm opening this up to all the panelists, so if we could maybe share Natalia and Carla on the screen too. The concept of resilience, which I think is what you ended up with this session, could you maybe, each of you, expand on that and the importance of it, and particularly, as we've just discussed, a really complex ecosystem of information is needed, and also maybe touch a little bit on the importance in terms of information and data that we really require to make such decisions. So maybe I start with one of our panelists on screen. Natalia or Carla, would either of you like to start that
Sure.
reply?
I'm happy to just offer one answer from the perspective of deep sea ecosystems. One thing that we should keep in mind when we think about the deep sea regarding the question of resilience is that a lot of times the time scales that things happen in the deep sea are much slower than the time scales in shallower water environments. And so when we think about resilience, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the communities that we see in kind of traditional deep sea ecosystems may be more sensitive to perturbation and therefore have kind of a less natural resilience, you could say, to the types of rapid changes that we're expecting and seeing right now with climate change. And so I think that matter of timescales is really important, and also just from the perspective of observing these systems, recognizing that a lot of times our deep sea ecosystems are really understudied and really under-monitored compared to shallower coastal habitats. And so that's also a really key point here for understanding their resilience to change.
Thank you. And Carla?
So from my side, I'd like to address the lack of data, and in a way, it is necessary to understand the response of all species to changes in order to truly identify the potential for resilience. But obviously that is not possible. So in order to come up with a best case scenario for management to encourage resilience in our marine ecosystems, we need as much information as possible about key species that are relevant to humans as a resource. So, some species are clearly not as sensitive as others, just like Natalia said, some ecosystems are more sensitive than others, but by understanding species resilience, we can encourage management of sensitive species and perhaps change our approach to how we manage resilient species in order to really identify how to correctly manage the situation and promote resilience among both the ecosystems and people who rely on them.
So I think it's also important to think about resilience of the coastal communities that are affected. And the problem of multiple stressors can really play into this, especially in terms of gender equity. There are many cultures around the world, whether you're looking at Portugal or Zanzibar, where women are primarily gathering in the intertidal zone, shellfish, octopus, other sorts of animals, and the men in the communities are fishing from boats. And so if we think about, again, the range of stressors, they're potentially affecting the different marine habitats differently. And so again, really understanding what is happening in these various locations, which stressors are important, and how they are individually and in combination affecting the communities is really critical. And clearly, as we heard, having the data to both understand what's going on and hopefully to address it and to even know whether our actions are having the desired effects is critical.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps one thing I'll say about resilience, I agree with all that has been said, is that I've always seen it as equivalent to the precautionary principle, but with a difference. And I think now in particular, the precautionary principle really, you don't do things just in case, there's a bad effect. I think now in a context where we have exceeded planetary boundaries and we are overstressing all sorts of systems, we've gone way beyond precaution. And the resilience, even where you don't know much, you can make a good case for, well, given that we know that we're stressing the systems, any decrease we can make in stresses in any area is good. Of course, trying to identify which ones are the most important to do that in is then a critical thing as well.
I guess that leads me to the next question, which really is, we are in the decade of ocean science, and we have a large number of initiatives here, but from your perspectives, maybe what do you see as the priority that we need? What's missing, or what do you see as the priority areas that need to be addressed in terms of addressing some of these multi-stressor actions? And then also to go back to a point made earlier is that we're looking at change across a period of a minimum of 10 years. So you're looking at change that will happen in a decadal cycle. So these are not quick solutions. So I think bearing those two in mind, I would be very interested in hearing your perspectives. So maybe this time, David, should I start with you?
Okay, thank you. So we're in an Ocean Decade session yesterday, and I think capacity building and training to fill the gaps in data is really important. But I think more about stresses, I would say certainly climate. We have to stop the carbon pollution that's happening right now. But also I think the other thing is that really understanding that the cumulative pollution impacts, the impacts from excess production and consumption patterns globally. I think if the Ocean Decade can really make a difference in getting the message out on that and really measuring and showing the impacts of these compounds and how they undermine resilience of ocean systems to climate and to other stresses, I think will be another one.
in addition, I think we need a better sort of conceptual or theoretical understanding of which stressors interact and have much greater than additive effects, and which ones we really can kind of address individually. And there are very few combinations of stressors that we really understand in this way. I mean, we're getting a really good understanding of how deoxygenation and warming interact both at the physiological level and ecological level. So that's one that we're really, there's a very clear physiological tie. We also have a good understanding of how behavioral responses to low oxygen wind up affecting fishing pressure. But in general, we really don't have a good understanding of how different stressors interact in a way that's predictive. We're still at the species by species stage for a lot of these things, where we need to do experiments on each individual species, and we're not, as a result, we're not really able to predict in general what's going to happen for the species we haven't tested yet. So I really think we really need to get a better handle on multi-species, multi-stressor interactions. Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe I ask Carla to provide some insight into her opinions.
I'd like to just emphasize what David said. I think that, obviously my intervention was all about this, how we need to fill the gaps where we don't have enough information. There's regions in the world that are completely unstudied at the moment for various reasons, whether it's lack of physical resources or in terms of expertise, or they're inaccessible because of unrest. And I think that those are all concerns that those areas are probably impacted the most, and we don't actually know what's going on there. And then, of course, as I also mentioned in my talk, something that I consider a priority is looking at how climate interacts with the other pressures, like overfishing, for example. And I actually wanted to bring up a nice example of this, which a colleague of mine, he did a study that looked at how fishing pressure affects the sensitivity of a fish species to climate factors. And basically, the hypothesis around this was that fishing removes the physiologically stronger individuals from a population, which basically renders them more vulnerable to climate stresses. So that is a very clear interaction. And I don't think that enough work has been done to identify how climate stresses are interacting with other stresses. And that just relates to also what's been said about pollution and, of course, removing habitats. There's so many ways that these stresses can interact, and we are really just touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding. So there really is a lot of work to be done, but prioritizing filling the data gaps and those key interactions that actually affect species survival in the short term, I think should be prioritized.
Thank you. And Natalia?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, of course, I'm a scientist, and I agree with all of the other panelists that having better data and more experiments is absolutely critical. But I think all of us on this panel also know that just because you have a lot of data and just because you have the good science, it doesn't mean that the management and policies are enacted that actually lead to sustainable marine management. And to me, one of the really important visions of the decade is that we move beyond just the scientific community to really bring in this broader base of ocean stakeholders, so that both within our science classrooms, our scientists are trained to also think about how you do kind of solutions-driven thinking and understand the management and policy context and how policies are enacted and what goes into that process, but that also we're constantly bringing in stakeholders as we design the science, as we figure out where we monitor and how we monitor, so that there's actually an action plan once we have that data and that science. So I think that to me is the really critical part of the decade, and I think it's important from a multi-stressor perspective, but it's also important from a broader ocean management perspective.
Well, that actually brings me to the next question, which really centers around policy and actually linking global policy, particularly around climate change issues, versus what is required at a regional level, and how do we ensure that that merges together to be cohesive, because that is always going to be a challenge. And I think you just started on some of those issues. I don't know if you'd like to care to expand a little bit or pass it on to somebody else.
Yeah, I think there are, in both of the regions that I brought up in my talk, I think there are really excellent policy initiatives, like the Ocean Protection Council in California, for example, is taking a really active role in making sure that the science that's produced is kind of thought through in terms of the management needs of the US West Coast and California specifically. In Norway, I think there has been kind of really excellent regional attention to the issue of deoxygenation in fjords. And for example, there was a very rapid policy response to move the salmon pens out of the fjord that had experienced this deoxygenation period. And so I think that having systems in place that allow rapid policy responses is really key, and having basically management bodies in place that are open to having very active discussion with scientists is really important, so that scientists are at the table, of course. And so I think that's what we hopefully will be moving towards globally, but it's easier said than done. And I think there are many regions of the world where we don't see that same relationship.
Thank you. Denise?
Well, I think Natalia pretty much answered the question. But the other thing that I would bring up is something that we see in the U.S. and I assume is potentially an issue in other countries as well, where different government agencies within a nation have different responsibilities, and so there are these silos where somebody is responsible for fisheries and somebody is responsible for chemical pollution and somebody is maybe the lead agency on climate change issues. And I think within nations we need to start thinking about breaking down those silos to more efficiently address the range of problems that we really have. Thanks.
Thanks. So I agree with what has been said, but I would add two things. So on the one hand, at the global level, so the broadest level, I think we need ambitious reductions in carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, because without that, every other action that we undertake is undermined. So I think that's the first thing that really has to be done. And then the second thing, and this circles around the SDG narrative model that I was presenting, is really is empowering local authorities and local communities and businesses to, one, understand their part, and then also to take action. So it's not just for governments to respond, it's not just for donors to give out money. I think is where all actors need to be empowered to reduce, I guess, their impacts, and then also for business and economy to finance the management and the actions that are needed to take place to I guess, get down to a net zero impact, I suppose, on nature.
Thank you. And this sort of leads to the next question, actually, which is really the issue of equity. Because some of these solutions that are identified, while they can actually solve the problem, they can create unintended consequences. And in complex situations where you have multiple stresses, multiple governance systems, that is a challenge. How do you see that being addressed, or what do you think should be done to actually start on that?
So yes, I mean a full commitment to equity first is the way to deal with that, and in general governance systems don't do that, because the governance is basically in the hands of the powerful, governing the weak. So I think transforming that is part of the transformative changes that the Sustainable Development Goals call for, And I think there's a lot of talk around that, and we have to walk that talk. And then I think really getting down to the local level with this governance so that people's interests can be heard. Because it's hard to aggregate a lot of voices from small scale locations and communities up to the large scale. But we can actually now, with all the communication technologies we have, we can take a lot of the global information and resources and so on down to the local. I think doing that.
Yes, and getting back to something that David brought up a minute ago is equity really absolutely depends on dealing with climate change, because we need to empower local governments, local communities, but the burden is going to wind up on them to deal with the combined effects of their local actions and global climate change. And we're seeing that worldwide in systems that have a problem, for example, with eutrophication, where a lot of places have been working very hard on developing policies and implementing actions to reduce nutrients, to improve oxygen situations in estuaries, to reduce algal blooms. But now all of those models that's based on have to be are being revisited, and what's emerging is that once you layer climate change stressors or warming, changes in precipitation on top of the problem of excess nutrients, everything that's being done is just not enough. And so equity really is going to depend on dealing with things at the global level as well as at the local level.
Thank you. Maybe I could ask Carla to respond.
So I agree as well, again, with everything that's been said. And perhaps something that could assist in this case is getting the buy-in at a citizen level. So, people have a lot of influence on governments and government decisions. And by having people involved and always including all your stakeholders in your various deliberations and decision-making is really important in encouraging governments to make the right decisions for everybody. So that's something that I think could assist with equity, including all stakeholders at all times in your deliberations and decisions.
Thank you. And Natalia?
Yeah, I also agree with what's already been said. I guess the only other point that I would make is that in terms of making sure that the solutions we enact are equitable, I think it's really important that we make sure that the most vulnerable communities, whoever those are, in whichever system we're working in, are included in the discussions so that we really hear their concerns. And that not only that, but they feel like that participation actually leads to results, because I think a lot of times when we talk about more vulnerable communities and we talk about bringing them to the table, sometimes that's all that happens, and then people feel like their time has been wasted. And of course, there are many other competing things for their time. And so making sure that those interactions both leave people feeling like their voices have been heard, they have been represented, something has happened as a result of their participation in that forum, and that also whenever it's possible, there's actually some sort of way of reimbursing people for their time. I think these are all issues that are quite important for actually making sure that these conversations can happen in an equitable way, and that we include the people who are most likely to be impacted by the types of solutions and impacts we've been talking about.
Thank you for that introduction. I just want to open the floor again to see if there's anybody who has a question to the panelists.
Thank you. I had a question earlier, but you took it from my lips, Janica. Had to do with the Ocean Decade. And I, just thinking about yesterday's session on the Ocean Decade, we had a reminder from Alison Clausen that there's going to be a second call for actions for Ocean Decade programs, projects, and actions. And maybe a bit of a naive question, but my question would be, if you had to put a program proposal together, as a scientist, I know we need more data, we need to use that data wisely, but if you could come up with a concrete fundable project, because these proposals for the Ocean Decade don't have to be funded, so you can still submit it and then find the funder next. So quite concisely, what would, if you had $1 million, what would be the program proposal that you would submit to the Ocean Decade this October?
Around multiple stresses. I suppose what I would do is, so I've been working on this SDG model a little bit, and also taking it forward in another process called the 17 rooms, it's called, where obviously a room per SDG. And I think it's to get it so that if you could bring this process into local contexts, so people can express the way they live by the ocean, and also hear how their peers or others around them do. And you get to see where there's alignment, you get to see where there's a conflict that we need to redress through marine spatial planning now. But of course, a lot of formalized processes take a long time. But this would be a way of really building that community understanding and buy-in to autonomously do things themselves and get more alignment that way. So, and that's to reduce stresses. That's what I would do.
So I think another way, another twist on a proposal, though, bringing in a range of stakeholders, is really to broaden geographically the kinds of surveys, projects that bring in local fishing communities, together with scientists and economists that we've been able to do in wealthier countries, to really better understand even the current situation. Just as an example, with deoxygenation, low oxygen in estuaries, there's a map that's been shown lots of places that was originally put together with data from Bob Diaz, really trying to compile every published record of low oxygen in estuaries. And what you'll see is that there are big areas of the world, especially in the Western Pacific, but at other places, that look like there's no problem. And it's really because the information is in the hands of local fishers, of local government agencies, and never makes it up into the international, peer-reviewed scientific literature. So I think there's just a real need, and it takes funding to reach out to get a much better understanding of the extent of problems that we have right now, and that's then the basis for trying to address them. For the ones that we don't know, obviously there are global problems that we know, and we shouldn't wait for more data.
So I would pass them to Carla.
So this question is actually really easy for me to answer, because there's a lot that still needs to be done, and funding is always the limitation. So in my case, I think I've been going on about this the whole evening, but I would focus my efforts on monitoring as many coastal environments as possible where there is currently no information. In order to inform any kind of climate change scenario, you need to first know what's happening. So starting with monitoring local conditions, like I said, in order to inform an experimental study looking at species responses, and then ultimately informing management. So for me, something that I feel strongly about is monitoring areas that are data deficient, and increasing capacity for people in those regions to do research and to monitor what's currently going on. So that would be my answer to that.
And Natalia.
Yeah, thanks. What an interesting question, right? So I would say I would not put it into research, believe it or not. So I would actually put it into implementing a model that has been developed at the University of Bergen and bringing it globally to more universities and more communities. So here at the University of Bergen, Katja Enberg is a professor who developed this really excellent SDG 214 course, which is really an active learning type course to inform students who are coming from a number of different disciplines. So you have natural scientists, social scientists, historians, people in philosophy. So all of these different student groups coming together to take this class together to really think about the Sustainable Development Goal 14, life underwater, and how it interacts with the other Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the students who took the class last year is from Ghana, and she asked me recently if there was a way that we could find funding to basically create that type of course, but in her university in Ghana that she used to be affiliated with. And I think this course is so unique in both the way that it encourages students to learn in a really different way than the way we usually teach college and master's level classes, and that it brings together students from different disciplines to really think about how we implement these really important ocean solutions. And so I would say put the $1 million into bringing that type of a class, but making it accessible to the wider community with professors in those local universities teaching classes like that. And then give students the challenge in that class of figuring out how you create a global multi-stressor climate change monitoring program that addresses both their regional needs as well as our global needs. Because then we create the leaders that will create the funding strategies for all that data that we're missing. And then all the other ocean professionals that we need to work with, the engaged stakeholder community.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so I'll give you 5 seconds.
I just wanted to mention one other really critical need, and that's the development of low-cost sensors. In a lot of countries, there are a lot of well-educated, interested professionals, and the cost of the technology is what prohibits the kind of monitoring that we need being done.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. I would like to thank all of our panelists, Carla, Natalia, Denise, and David. Really appreciate it. I wish we had more time, but the clock's ticked out, and thank you very much for your participation. We really appreciate it. Have a good evening, and hopefully see you later. Thank you.